this is Scott Allen Miller, and on Sam IT today we're going to continue our series on quality of service and networking with a talk about why limits are bad. Now, if you've been working with QoS or looking into QoS or considering something like this, or maybe if you're working with VoIP, you've heard people tell you that maybe you should consider putting limits on your network. What I mean is, it could be a limit, it could be a reservation, but these are all basically the same mechanism, and that is setting aside a certain amount of your network bandwidth for a specific service. This may sound like a good idea. You have 10 telephone users, you need to have 100 kilobits per second set aside for each of them, so you aggregate that and you set aside 1 megabit per second for all of them. That way they're guaranteed to have that bandwidth when they need it. That sounds logical, sounds incredibly simple, and that's what you would want to do, right? Never. This makes no logical sense whatsoever. In a world without quality of service, this might make sense, right? You have some service that simply has to have 1 megabit available to it and you can't risk it not having that. Great, set aside 1 megabit for it. But in the real world, we have quality of service in any scenario where we could put in reservations. So this becomes a very silly thing. Now, before I get into that, if you're an ISP, you may have a scenario where you must set aside bandwidth that is not used for anyone for customers. And in those cases, that's where reservations exist for. They exist for political reasons, not technology ones. There's no real technology reason to do this, as there are better ways to handle it, such as quality of service. But if you are selling dedicated bandwidth, you may want to use reservations on an ISP basis because you're not looking to do the best thing for your customers, you're looking to simply make it simple for you to manage for them. As IT for a business, you always care about your customers. You don't ever want to cripple the organization just to prove a political point. And you certainly don't want to do that with your network technologies. And that's what reservations will do. If that doesn't make sense, let's use a highway example. Let's say you have a 10-lane highway. Under quality of service, you would get to use all 10 lanes unless something like an ambulance or a fire truck were to come in, they would get priority. People would pull over, wait, and let them pass before using all 10 lanes again. All 10 lanes are always available for everyone to use, and all 10 lanes are always in use as long as there's traffic, and it's just that high priority vehicles get to go first and pass other people when they need to. With reservations, we actually take lanes and set them aside, a little bit more like an HOV. So in these cases, let's say you have 1 megabit out of 10 megabit total, or 10 lanes. 1 lane is set aside for VoIP. Let's say you set another 1 lane aside for video teleconferencing, and another 1 lane set aside for accounting. Pretty soon, you've set aside a large percentage of your total highway. But in reality, those services will almost never use, or possibly never use, their entire allotted reservation. That means that there's empty lanes much of the time, while the other lanes may be congested. That causes a situation where everybody goes slower. Nobody's getting the maximum value out of your network. Everybody loses. There are no winners. The people who have the reservations aren't getting anything they wouldn't have already gotten from quality of service. It's just that all their other things suffer even more. At best, some of your services behave the same and the others suffer. And at worst, everybody suffers. With quality of service, you get to have the maximum performance for the things that matter, and the things that pay for that pay the least penalty possible. So quality of service always trumps reservations in scenarios where you care about your customers, i.e. in situations where your customer is the business, right? So reservations when you hate customers and you want to punish them. Quality of service when you care and you want to do a good job for everybody. Because remember, there are no losers. It's amazing how often reservations are recommended. I don't know why or where this comes from, or who thinks this is a good idea to reserve portions of your bandwidth to sit idle for things that will never use them. It's also important to remember for things like VoIP, just as an example, that if you come up with a maximum of 1 megabit that they can use and you set that as a reservation, the chances are with 10 users that you will hit 1 megabit approaches 0. It's almost impossible to ever hit that maximum number. In fact, you'll almost never hit half that number. Probably most of the time, you'll be between 1 and 5% of that number. That's problematic because the amount that you have to set aside is very large compared to the amount you will normally use. And if you were to shrink that and say set aside a reservation of only say 5 or 10% of your maximum, this may sound reasonable, but the time when you would need quality of service is when you're above that minimum amount, at which point you wouldn't have a reservation for that traffic and you'd be hitting the same congestion. So when you're using reservations, you are either giving up the thing that you're trying to get, which is protection against saturation, or you're simply throwing away a portion of your network, which, if you're hitting saturation, just exacerbates everyone else's saturation, right? So even if you say you only care about audio and video and some accounting traffic, and you don't care about quality of service for everyone else, and you don't care about maximum, you set those things aside. Things like your backups, things like your disk transfers, things like your web browsing, things like your email will all get slower, right? And not just slower because they're hitting saturation, but your total bandwidth goes down. So if you were, say, taking 1 hour of total saturation time, that might extend to an entire day. It doesn't take much when you're already saturated to cut that down, to have that then sprawl out of control, because when you're saturated, that means you are backing up. So if you are saturated for, say, half a second under normal conditions, if you were to take reservations of, say, 30% of your network for what you consider priority traffic, you very likely now have that 1 second, that 1/2 second may turn into a nearly 1 second delay for that traffic of full saturation, during which time new traffic will be generated and may start a situation where you can never catch up. Now, of course, mostly traffic is very spiky, so probably you would catch up, probably in just a few seconds, but it's a risk that you will simply move things to a point where you can no longer keep up. If you're doing things like backups or other large file transfers over or sync jobs over your WAN connection, it's actually not too hard to take something that with quality of service works incredibly well. For example, you may need to upload a few terabytes of backups every day. With quality of service, you can do this and keep your line at nearly 100% saturation around the clock, as long as you have just enough time for your backup job to finish before the next one starts. But with quality of service, you can still keep things like your telephone calls working perfectly well during that time without any problems whatsoever, because your quality of service overcomes the saturation for the traffic that matters. You probably would also want to prioritize things like DNS calls to make sure that you're able to look up websites. The actual looking at websites mostly is a download operation, but DNS calls are an upload, or outbound. So you need those calls to go through in a timely manner, but they're small. So having priority of quality of service on that with priority may make a lot of sense while your backup is going on. That said, if we were to use reservations and we were at, say, 23 hours a day used for a regular backup job to upload that works perfectly well under quality of service, even having a tiny reservation of just 10% of the total bandwidth guarantees that backup job could not complete in a 24-hour window anymore, and it doesn't guarantee that our phone calls will work any better. In fact, they may work worse in case they ever go larger than the reservation amount. They would suddenly start clipping. So it's pretty easy once you start looking at it to see that there's a huge amount of danger to limits with no value, and quality of service simply provides all the things that we're looking for all of the time, because it can do anything that limits and reservations can do, but it can do it better with everyone's best interest in mind. Thanks for joining me. I hope that we have really covered a lot of quality of service and reservations and networking, especially around high priority traffic. I hope this is very helpful to you. Remember to like and subscribe, have your comments below, and if you want to sponsor us, you can do so on Patreon.